Hello class, welcome back. Today we are going to be talking about chapter 6, which is related to observational methods. So now we're going to begin talking about different ways in which we can collect data for our research. This will be really important for us as we move forward in the rest of our chapters. So make sure that you're spending a good bit of time looking over the chapter material and making sure that you do thoroughly understand the different methods that we'll be using. Of course, as always, I'm happy to answer any of those questions. Feel free to schedule those office hours with me if you'd like to ask something a little bit more pointed. So let's go ahead and get started. In terms of data, we have two fundamental types of data collection. The first is quantitative data, and this is related to numbers, tests, counting, measuring. And then we've got qualitative data. This is related to things like words or images. Maybe if we're making observations, we might be coding a conversation or looking through photographs, something like that. So when we have numerical values, we're engaging in this quantitative data collection. And predominantly, we see quantitative data in psychology. Qualitative data might be reserved for things like anthropology. You might see it in sociology as well. But typically in psychology, we use a lot of quantitative data. What are the differences between each of these approaches? Well, in quantitative approaches, as I talked about, we're looking at numbers, right? Specifically here, we're focusing on behavior that can be quantified in some way. So remember, in order to do this, you'll need to have some kind of coding mechanism, some way of obtaining that data. With quantitative data, we can actually use large sample sizes. So for example, when we get into a survey chapter, when we're collecting data using survey methods, this will be quantitative in nature. We have a numeric value that's associated with it. And we can collect data with using a large sample size. We can collect hundreds or even thousands of participants. Our conclusions in quantitative data then are based on statistical analyses. This is why we have you take the research methods course, and then you move into statistics. And then after that, you're going to move into capstone. So you're going to apply all of this together. So this is why all of this information will build on one another. So the statistical analyses piece is extremely important because your ability to interpret data is only as good as your statistical knowledge. In fact, individuals who are really strong in stats are going to be able to look at that data and help us see very different things than somebody who's not that great at stats. Maybe they can just help us see means, right? So some of these complex modeling, things like that stats are going to be really beneficial for you. So particularly if you were going into graduate school, having a very strong background in research methods and stats is extremely important. They will be the foundation for the rest of your graduate work. In the qualitative approach, here we're kind of looking at behavior. Our qualitative data, that collection is going to be limited to smaller groups because we are going to be observing and recording, right? And this isn't going to be numerical recording. We may say, transcribing a conversation that's taking place, right? And the conclusions that we can make as a researcher are going to be individually dependent. So unlike with a numerical value where I've got a number and I use stats and it is going to tell me, this group scored higher than this group, I don't have that with a qualitative approach, right? So now the interpretations are going to be based on the researcher and what the researcher sort of sees. There are several different types of observational research. I'm going to go over these 5 different observational research types with you. Of course, I strongly encourage you to go back and take a look at your readings, because there will be greater detail that will be provided over and above what we're going to do in these mini lectures. In a naturalistic observation, the researcher is going to make observations typically in the field. And they're going to do so by watching something over an extended period of time. Now, naturalistic observation is sometimes used in psychology, but it's more often used in sociology or anthropology. There was in psychology, case kind of looking at individuals, right? So there is an example in psychology of cognition in the wild, even things. And so sort of how does our cognition develop? And we're using natural settings. We're observing that behavior as it takes place. A researcher very much known for her naturalistic observation is Dr. Jane Goodall, and she actually observed chimpanzees in their natural environment, and she actually brought us a lot of information that we didn't know about chimpanzees previously. Starting with tool usage, we thought that human beings were the only ones that were able to create tools and use them. This we found out to be not the case. So she would be sort of that gold standard of what we might think of when we look into naturalistic observations. I have a video posted in your PowerPoint notes kind of going over some of the work that Dr. Jane Goodall has done. So if you've got some time to look over that, I would highly suggest it. Our next type of observation is systematic observation. And so here we are observing one or more specific behaviors in a very particular setting. So we need to have procedures in place on how that data is going to be recorded. It will be quantitative in nature. We'll have some kind of numeric value that we get from that. In order to do this, we would need to have a very specific and predefined coding system. So our operational definition is going to be crucial here. So for example, maybe I want to observe social behavior in young children. And so I am watching children, and every 15 minutes, I record what type of behavior the child is engaging in, whether it's unoccupied, solitary, together play, parallel play, group play, right? And so I have a stopwatch, I click, and I hit 15 minutes. When my timer goes off, I then record what that child is doing, right? What behavior that child has engaged in during that 15-minute period. And so here I had to have some sort of coding measures ahead of time. And I also needed to have some system for how I was going to do that, right? So, that every 15 minutes, I would need to know what each of these types of play look like, so that I had a very specific understanding of that. In 1974, Hardup did a systematic observation where he recorded frequencies and types of aggression that children evidenced in preschool. So this would be a very common setup to do that systematic observation. I actually think this is from my undergrad university, but these are set up in child care facilities at universities all over the place. So this is actually a two-way mirror. The children will be playing in here, and the researchers would be sitting outside on this side of the wall. As a researcher, you could look in and see the children, but the children, when they look at you, would just see simply a mirror. This is really wonderful because you can actually hear the children as well in here. There are speakers that are set up as well. And so this was a way, when I was an undergraduate research assistant, I was actually able to take part in a research study where we used this sort of setup. And in it, we did something like this, where we actually observed the different types of play that children were engaging in. And by being on this side of the mirror, children had no idea that they were actually being observed. So it really ensured that the behavior was much more natural, that children were just engaging in types of activities that they would want to anyway. We can also do something called a contrived observation, or something that's a little bit more set up. So this can also be done in the lab or in the field. A very well-known sort of contrived observational method or research setup occurs with Ainsworth's strange situation paradigm. And this is a series of separations and reunions that a child experiences. There are a little bit different modifications of this, but the basic paradigm looks something like this. Mom comes into the lab with the kid. They're hanging out, they're playing. Stranger comes into the lab. Mom gets up and leaves, and then stranger attempts to interact with the child. And then parent comes back into the room, and the researcher observes how child and mother are now interacting with one another, and taking a look at those attachment styles. Another variation of this is the stranger actually doesn't exist. Mom just comes in, she plays with child, she gets up and leaves, and then she comes back in after some period of time. So in this case, what is being observed is how that child responds to the parent whenever they come in, and then we note what type of attachment style they have to the parent. Case studies are going to be research that is conducted on one, maybe two individuals. It's very, very in-depth. It is really great when you've got a person with a really rare condition. So this young woman right here is named Jeannie. Jeannie was severely abused as a child. When authorities found her, she was actually tied to this potty chair. She was 13 years old and she didn't know how to speak. This is because her mother and father used to bark at her, but they never actually spoke with her. And so researchers took the opportunity to see if Jeannie could ever cultivate spoken language, or if there was this critical period of language development after which, as human beings, we can't acquire language anymore. And so this research was done simply with Jeannie. We couldn't do this, kind of going back to our ethics chapter. This would definitely not be ethical to not speak to a child and then see if they could be spoken to. So because we found a very specific individual in very specific circumstances, we could then, as researchers, figure out how her language developed because we were given that opportunity. And so case studies are really, really great for that. You may also have remembered from your intro to psych Phineas Gage, right? He had like a railroad tire that went through part of his brain. It completely changed his personality. So we've got individuals like this where because of circumstance, we are able to observe very specific behaviors in them that we may not otherwise be able to. And so case studies really allow us to do that. This is great, again, for those rare conditions. The last type of research I'd like to talk to you about in this chapter is observational research, is archival research. This also is a type of observational research, or it falls under one of the categories that we have discussed. Archival research is taking a look at data that's already been collected. So we can look at previously existing records, and we can use those data points to help answer research questions. Things like census data or police records, right? These are data points that already have been collected, and it may not have been used for what the research question that we particularly have, but we can go back and reanalyze that data. This can be a really, really rich data source for us. It's also a lot of time savings. So instead of going out and collecting the data, all of that on your own, the data already exists. So if you can apply a hypothesis to data that is already in existence, it can really cut down the amount of time that you have to spend with that data collection. So what happens is we take a look at that previously collected data. We can run additional analyses on that data, and perhaps we can figure out or we're able to find new and interesting findings that we didn't really know existed. So, looking at this particular research study, looked at marriage license applications between 1970 and 1980. And during those marriage applications, they wanted to take a look at how many of the couples, when they applied for their marriage license, shared the same address versus had different addresses. In 1970, only 13% of the couples had shared addresses. In 1980, 53% of the couples used shared addresses. And so because of this, right, this illustrates an increase in premarital cohabitation. We could have gone out and asked people and collected this data, but it almost seems unnecessary for us to do so when we can go back and look at data that's already been collected. Again, it wasn't specifically used to answer this research question, but man, does it make it a lot easier to be able to look at this data because it's already been collected for us. All right, so this gives us kind of a short, condensed version of the big takeaway points from our observational research chapter. Of course, as always, there's lots of little details in there that we don't get to cover. So please make sure that you bring those questions to me if you have them. I'll leave you here with some key terms for this chapter. For those of you who are really big into flashcards, I always post these at the end of your PowerPoints. I feel that they're a really, really great way to make sure that you really understand the different terms that are being used in this chapter. For each of these terms, I would make sure not only to write the definition, but also to give an example. So that way, when you're studying when you're taking those post-tests, you don't just know the basic definition, you also know how to apply it in a context. So kind of think about that as you're sort of studying, and think about how you could maybe make the best use of that time, putting the information, all of that together. All right, so that kind of brings us to the end of this chapter. As always, feel free to reach out to me if you have any questions. Have a wonderful day. Bye-bye.